It is the winter of 1817, and a young woman in tattered clothing has just been discovered collapsed on a country road in Gloucestershire, England. She speaks a language no one can understand. She gestures toward the east, toward the sea, with wild desperation. She refuses to eat anything but vegetables. She sleeps on the floor rather than the bed. When locals bring her to the attention of a wealthy family, she makes a single sign they do understand. She points to herself and mimes placing a crown upon her own head. Within weeks, she will be living in a manor house, dressed in silk, attended by servants, hosting visits from aristocrats and scholars who have travelled from across England to meet her. They call her Princess Caraboo of Javasu, and they truly believe, that she is royalty from a distant island kingdom. She is, in fact, a cobbler's daughter from Devon named Mary Baker, and her story is just one of dozens throughout history, where ordinary women dared to claim they were queens. What drives a person to such audacity? What desperation? What hunger? What impossible circumstances make impersonating royalty seem like the best available option? And what happened to these women when inevitably the truth came out? Tonight, we are stepping into a world of silk and deception, of thrones and frauds, of women who refused to accept the small lives they were given and invented magnificent lies instead. Some were con artists. Some were mentally unwell, some were genuinely uncertain of their own identities, and some, just possibly, were telling the truth all along. Their stories are stranger than any fiction, and they have much to teach us about identity, survival, and the lengths to which human beings will go to become someone else. Before we begin this journey together, I want to welcome you, wherever you are listening tonight. Perhaps you are already in bed, the lights dimmed, the world quieting around you. Perhaps you are drifting towards sleep, or perhaps you are wide awake and curious. Either way, I am glad you are here. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, history told gently, for the quiet hours, I hope you will consider subscribing to this channel, and perhaps leaving a like so that others might find their way here too. And I would love to know, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Leave a comment and tell me. I read every single one. And there is something lovely about imagining all of us scattered across the world, sharing these strange and beautiful stories together. Now settle in, adjust your pillows if you need to. Let the tension leave your shoulders. We have a long night of queens and pretenders ahead of us, and there is no rush. These stories have waited centuries to be told. They can wait a few moments more, while you get comfortable. And the first thing we need to understand is this: the desire to be royalty, to escape your own life entirely, and become someone magnificent, is far more common than you might imagine. And for women throughout history, that desire was often born of desperation rather than ambition. Let me ask you something. Have you ever, even for a moment, imagined yourself as someone else entirely? Not just a better version of yourself, but a completely different person. Someone with a different name, a different history, a different future. Someone who wakes up in silk sheets instead of cotton, who is served rather than serving, whose words carry weight simply because of who they are. Most of us have entertained this fantasy at least fleetingly. It is human, this desire for transformation. We read fairy tales about servant girls who become princesses. We watch films about ordinary people discovered to be secret heirs. We dream sometimes of doors opening onto lives, utterly unlike our own. But there is a vast difference between dreaming of being someone else and actually claiming to be someone else. Between fantasy and fraud, between a private wish and a public declaration that you are, in fact, royalty. What drives a person across that line? The answer, I think, lies in understanding just how limited the options were for women throughout most of history, and I mean truly understanding it, not as an abstract fact, but as a lived reality that shaped every moment of every day. Imagine you are a woman born in England in the late 1700s. Your family is poor. Not destitute, perhaps, but poor. Your father is a tradesman, a cobbler, or a fiddler, or a farmer scratching a living from difficult soil. Your mother works constantly, and still there is never quite enough. You receive little education, because education costs money, and besides, what would a girl need with learning? Your future is written before you take your first step. You will go into service perhaps, scrubbing floors and carrying chamber pots for families wealthier than your own. Or you will marry young, some local man of similar circumstances, and spend your life in labor and childbirth until your body gives out. If you are unlucky, if your father drinks, if your husband is violent, If illness strikes, if the harvest fails, you may end up in the workhouse, that dreaded institution where the poor were sent to labor in grim conditions until they died. These were the options: service, marriage, poverty, or prostitution, for nearly all women, for nearly all of history. These were the boundaries of the possible. Now imagine you are clever. Imagine you have a quick mind, a talent for language, an ability to read people and situations. Imagine you can see, with painful clarity, the gap between what you are capable of and what you are permitted to do. Imagine you look at the women in silk gowns stepping out of carriages, and you know, that you are their equal in everything, except the accident of birth. What do you do with that knowledge? What do you do with that hunger? For most women, the answer was nothing. You swallowed your ambition. You accepted your lot. You told yourself that God had placed you where you belonged. That virtue lay in acceptance. That wanting more was sinful pride. You scrubbed the floors and carried the chamber pots, and tried not to think too much about what might have been. But some women could not swallow it. Some women looked at the narrow path laid out before them and refused to walk it. And a few of those women, the cleverest, the most desperate, the most audacious, decided that if they could not change their circumstances, they would change their identities entirely. Royal impersonation, as a crime, makes a certain terrible sense when you understand the alternatives. Yes, it was dangerous. Yes, the punishment if caught could be severe: imprisonment, public humiliation, even death in earlier periods. But consider what the impersonator gained, even temporarily: wealth, comfort, respect, attention, agency. For a few weeks or months or years, she was someone. She mattered. She was served instead of serving, listened to instead of ignored, valued instead of invisible. And there was one more factor that made royal impersonation possible, especially for women: the fluidity of identity in a world without photographs, without databases, without fingerprints or DNA tests. If you appeared in a new town, dressed well, and spoke with authority, who could prove you were not who you claimed to be? Identity was a matter of behavior and appearance, of social recognition and collective agreement. If enough people believed you were a princess, then in every practical sense, you were a princess, at least until someone who knew better came forward. This is the context in which our stories unfold. These are not tales of random madness or unmotivated greed. These are tales of women navigating impossible constraints with the only tools available to them: their wits, their nerve, and their willingness to become someone else entirely. The women we will meet tonight fall into several categories, though the lines between them are often blurry. Some were opportunists, women who saw a chance and took it, calculating the risks and rewards with clear eyes. Some were desperate escapees, women fleeing terrible circumstances who invented royal identities as a form of protection or cover. Some were possibly genuine, cases where identity was truly uncertain, where the woman herself might not have known the truth of her origins. Some were caught up in mass delusions, communities that wanted so badly to believe a lost royal had returned that they convinced themselves, and everyone around them, and some were mentally unwell, women whose claims stemmed from genuine psychological conditions, from breaks with reality that they could not control. We will meet women from all of these categories tonight, and in each case, we will ask the same questions. Why did she do it? How did she almost get away with it? What happened when the truth came out? And what does her story teach us about identity, survival, and the human hunger for transformation? But enough of abstractions. Let me take you now to meet our first pretender, the woman whose story I began with, the cobbler's daughter, who became Princess Caraboo. Her tale is one of the most romantic, most elaborate, and most ultimately melancholy in all of British history, and it begins on a muddy road in Gloucestershire, in the spring of 1817, when a young woman in strange clothing appeared out of nowhere and changed everything. Rest here for a moment, take a breath, feel the weight of your body against the bed, the softness of your pillow. We are just beginning, you and I. There are hours of stories ahead, and no need to rush. Let the world outside grow quiet. Let the day's worries drift away. We are going somewhere else now. To another century, another country, another life entirely. And when you are ready, come with me to meet Mary Baker, who became Caraboo, who wanted so desperately to be someone else that she invented an entire world. You are a villager in Almondsbury, Gloucestershire, on a chilly April evening in 1817. The day has been long, and you are walking the country road toward home. thinking about supper, about the ache in your feet, about the ordinary concerns of an ordinary life. And then you see her. She is standing at the side of the road, a young woman perhaps in her mid-20s. Her clothing is strange, not English, certainly, but you cannot place the origin. There is something exotic about the cut of her dress, the arrangement of her shawl. Her hair is dark, pinned up in an unusual style. Her skin is pale but weathered, as though she has travelled far. Her eyes, when she looks at you, are wide and confused. But there is something else there too, something you cannot quite name. Intelligence, perhaps, or desperation. You approach, you ask if she needs help, if she is lost, if you can direct her somewhere. She responds, but not in any language you have ever heard. The words are melodic, strange, completely incomprehensible. She gestures wildly, pointing toward the east, toward where the sun would rise. She seems exhausted, frightened, disoriented. What do? You are a decent person, and she is clearly in need. You take her arm, gently, and guide her toward the village. You bring her to the overseer of the poor, because what else can you do? She cannot tell you who she is or where she came from. She is clearly not from here. Someone will need to sort this out. And from this simple act of charity, this ordinary human kindness extended to a stranger in distress, begins one of the strangest deceptions in British history. The young woman was brought before Samuel Worrell, a local magistrate and county banker of considerable standing. He was puzzled by her, as anyone would be. She carried no papers, no identification. She could not or would not speak English. She gestured, she drew pictures, she made signs, but she could not explain who she was, or how she had come to be wandering the roads of Gloucestershire. Worrell, uncertain what to do with her, considered sending her to the workhouse, the standard destination for paupers and vagrants, but his wife Elizabeth Worrell took a different interest. There was something about this strange young woman that intrigued her. Elizabeth was educated, curious, perhaps a little bored with the provincial routine of country life. She looked at this mysterious visitor and saw not a problem to be disposed of, but a puzzle to be solved. Elizabeth began to study her. She watched how the young woman behaved, noted her habits and preferences, tried to decode the language she spoke, and what she observed was remarkable. The stranger refused to eat meat, accepting only vegetables. She climbed trees with remarkable agility, scrambling up into the branches, as though she had done it all her life. She refused to sleep in a bed, preferring to rest on the floor, and when she did sleep, she positioned herself facing east. She performed strange prayers, bowing toward the sun, chanting words that no one could understand. She recoiled from alcohol as though it were poison. She swam naked, which scandalized the English servants who witnessed it, though the stranger seemed utterly unself-conscious about her body. And there was more. She made pictures, drawings of weapons she seemed to recognize, sketches of scenes from what appeared to be her homeland. She bore scars on her back that looked like the marks of injury or violence. She pointed to these scars and gestured at the sea, at ships, suggesting some kind of abduction or captivity. Most remarkably, she had a name for herself and a word for seemingly everything around her. She called herself Caraboo. She had names for the furniture, the food, the trees, the sky. She counted in her language, sang songs in it, prayed in it. This was not random babbling, not mere nonsense sounds. This was a consistent vocabulary, used the same way every time. She was speaking a language, just not any language that anyone in England recognized. Elizabeth Worrell was fascinated. She brought scholars to meet Caraboo, linguists and academics, who attempted to analyze her speech. They compared it to Portuguese, to Arabic, to various Asian languages. They could not identify it, but they agreed it had the consistency of a genuine tongue. They published papers about her, this strange princess from unknown lands who had washed up on the shores of England. Because by now, that was the prevailing theory, Caraboo was a princess. The signs all pointed to it, or so the believers thought. Through gestures and the gradual interpretation of her language, a story emerged, pieced together by Elizabeth Worrell and the scholars who studied her, confirmed bit by Caraboo's reactions and additions. She was, they came to believe, Princess Caraboo of Javasu, an island kingdom somewhere in the Indian Ocean. Her father had been a Chinese chief, her mother a woman of Javasu, who had died when Caraboo was young. She had been kidnapped by pirates, grabbed from her homeland, and carried across the ocean on a terrible journey. She had been sold, abused, held captive for months or years, but when the ship that carried her finally approached the coast of England, she had seized her chance. She had jumped overboard, swum to shore, and wandered lost and desperate, until she was discovered on that road in Almondsbury. It was, you must admit, a wonderful story, romantic, dramatic, full of danger and courage and exotic mystery. It explained everything: her strange clothing, her unknown language, her scars, her behaviors, her disorientation, and it captured the imagination of Regency England like wildfire. Word spread. Newspapers picked up the story of the mysterious princess found in Gloucestershire. The Worrells began hosting visitors, aristocrats and scholars who travelled from London and beyond to meet this remarkable woman. Caraboo received them graciously, demonstrating her customs, speaking her language, showing the rituals of her homeland. She created a headdress from peacock feathers and wore it with evident pride. She used a bow and arrow with surprising skill. She beat a tambourine and a gong, danced and sang and prayed. She was magnificent, she was fascinating, she was, by any measure, an extraordinary performer. But here is the question that haunts this story, the question you might already be asking. How? How did a young woman with no education, no resources, no training, create something so elaborate? How did she invent an entire language? Not just a few words, but a consistent vocabulary with its own internal logic. How did she construct a mythology so complete, a performance so sustained, that scholars and aristocrats were fooled for months? The answer, I think, lies in understanding who Mary Baker, because that was her real name, actually was. Mary Baker was born around 1791 in Witheridge, Devon, in the southwest of England. Her father was a cobbler, a respectable trade but not a wealthy one. The family struggled, as so many families did. Mary received little formal education. She went into domestic service as a young woman, working as a servant in various households, the expected path for a girl of her circumstances. But Mary was not suited to service. She was restless, imaginative, perhaps difficult. She lost positions repeatedly. She drifted from household to household, never settling, never finding a place where she fit. She spent time in the workhouse, that grim destination of the desperate. She wandered the country, looking for something, though perhaps she could not have said what, and somewhere along the way, she began to experiment with becoming someone else. Before Caraboo, there were other personae. Mary tried passing herself off as a French refugee at one point, fleeing the upheavals on the continent. She attempted other identities, other stories. She was searching for one that worked, one that would stick, one that would open doors that were otherwise closed to a cobbler's daughter from Devon. When she created Caraboo, she created something remarkable. She drew on everything she had absorbed during her wanderings, fragments of foreign customs she had witnessed, behaviors she had seen or heard described, the exoticism that Regency England found so alluring. She invented a language out of whole cloth, perhaps drawing on sounds she had heard, perhaps inventing from pure imagination. She gave herself a history, a culture, a religion, a name. And she maintained it. For months she never broke character. She stayed in her invented language, followed her invented customs, lived as Caraboo every moment of every day. When scholars tested her, she passed their tests. When visitors tried to trip her up, she remained consistent. This was not a simple lie told once and defended. This was a complete identity, sustained under intense scrutiny. Think about what that required: the intelligence to invent something so elaborate, the memory to keep it consistent, the self-control to never slip, never reveal herself, never break character even in moments of stress or surprise. The emotional discipline to live as someone else entirely, to suppress your true self so completely that it never surfaced. Mary Baker was, by any measure, a kind of genius. Not educated, not trained, not advantaged in any way, but brilliant nonetheless. Her crime, such as it was also her masterpiece. But no performance lasts forever, and the exposure when it came was almost absurdly simple. In June of 1817, a woman named Mrs. Neal came forward. She had seen the newspaper articles about Princess Caraboo. She had studied the published drawings of this mysterious foreign princess, and she recognized her. Mary Baker had worked in Mrs. Neal's household as a servant several years earlier. Mrs. Neal remembered her perfectly well, a restless young woman from Devon, clever but difficult, prone to telling wild stories. There was no Princess Caraboo. There was only Mary, the cobbler's daughter, playing the most elaborate game of make-believe anyone had ever seen. Elizabeth Worrell confronted her, and Mary finally confessed. The story came tumbling out. Her real name, her real history, her real circumstances. She told them about her father the cobbler, her time in service, her wanderings across the country. She explained how she had invented Caraboo, drawing on things she had seen and heard and imagined. She admitted that the language was her own creation, that the customs were invented, that the entire mythology of Javasu was a fabrication. She was, she admitted, just Mary Baker from Witheridge, no princess, no exotic origin, just a desperate young woman who had wanted, so badly, to be someone else. And here is the part of the story that moves me most. Elizabeth Worrell did not have her prosecuted. Consider what Elizabeth could have done. She could have charged Mary with fraud, with vagrancy, with any number of crimes. She could have sent her to prison, had her publicly humiliated, made an example of her. The deception had been elaborate, sustained, and had fooled Elizabeth herself, a wealthy, educated woman who prided herself on her discernment. Elizabeth would have been well within her rights to feel furious, betrayed, made a fool of. But instead, she showed mercy. Perhaps she was embarrassed, and wanted the whole affair to go away quietly. Perhaps she felt some lingering affection for the strange young woman who had lived in her house for months. Perhaps she recognized something in Mary's desperation, some hunger she could understand even if she could not approve of how it had been expressed. Whatever her reasons, Elizabeth Worrell paid for Mary Baker's passage to America. She gave her money and sent her across the ocean to start fresh, to begin again, to perhaps find some legitimate outlet for her remarkable talents. And Mary went. She sailed to Philadelphia in the summer of 1817, leaving behind her brief career as a princess, her exposure and humiliation, her entire life in England. But she could not stop being Caraboo. In America she tried to restart her act, appearing at exhibitions, performing her exotic princess routine for audiences who might not have heard of her exposure. It worked. For a little while. Americans were curious about this strange woman with her invented language, her foreign customs. But word traveled. The truth caught up with her. Her American career as Caraboo fizzled. Eventually Mary returned to England, and here the story takes its melancholy final turn. She lived until 1864, a long life, spanning nearly 3/4 of the 19th century. She married at some point, had a daughter, but she never achieved any other moment of fame or success. In her later years, she earned a living selling leeches to the Bristol infirmary. She had gone from princess to leech seller, from silk gowns to the grim trade of harvesting blood-sucking worms, from ponds to supply the medical practices of the day. And yet, by all accounts, she never entirely let go of Caraboo. Even in old age, she apparently maintained some version of the story, some claim to her invented identity. Whether she still believed it herself, whether she had ever believed it, we will never know. Perhaps Caraboo had become more real to her than Mary Baker. Perhaps, after a lifetime of being nobody, the brief months of being somebody were too precious to surrender entirely. Think about that for a moment, as you lie there in the dark. Think about Mary Baker, cobbler's daughter, servant girl, wanderer, a woman with nothing to her name but her own quick mind. She invented a princess out of nothing. She created a language, a culture, a history. She fooled scholars and aristocrats for months. She achieved, for one brief shining period, the escape she had always longed for. And then she spent the rest of her life selling leeches, holding on to the memory of having been, however briefly, someone magnificent. What do we make of her? Was she a criminal, a fraud, a con artist who deserved punishment? Was she a victim of impossible circumstances, driven to desperate measures by a world that offered her no legitimate path forward? Was she mentally unwell, lost in a fantasy she could not distinguish from reality? Was she simply a woman of extraordinary imagination, born into the wrong time and the wrong circumstances? I think she was all of these things, and none of them capture her entirely. She was Mary Baker, she was Princess Caraboo. She was a human being who wanted a different life so badly that she created one from thin air. And her story has lasted 2 centuries because something in it resonates. Something about the hunger for transformation, the fluidity of identity, The way desperation and creativity can combine into something extraordinary and doomed. Rest here for a moment, let Mary's story settle into your mind. The peacock feathers, the invented language, the prayers facing the rising sun, the exposure and the mercy, and the long decline into obscurity. In our next chapter, we will travel to a very different place and time, to Berlin in the aftermath of the First World War, where a woman would emerge from a suicide attempt with a claim that would consume her entire life. She would insist, for 64 years, that she was Grand Duchess Anastasia of Russia, the sole survivor of the massacre that killed the Romanov family. Her story would divide nations, spawn court cases and forensic investigations, and remain unresolved until long after her death. But for now, let Mary rest. She has earned it, perhaps, this clever, desperate woman who dreamed of being a princess, and for a little while, was one. Sleep if you are tired, the story will be here when you wake, and if you are still awake, if you are curious to know what happened to the woman who claimed to be Anastasia, then come with me. Come to Berlin, in February of 1920, to a bridge over the Landwehr Canal, where a young woman has just jumped into the icy water, trying to end her life, and is about to begin a mystery that will last nearly a century. You are a nurse in a Berlin mental hospital in the winter of 1920. The war has been over for just over a year, but its effects are everywhere. In the wounded men who fill the wards, in the shortages and deprivations, in the haunted look that seems to hang over the city. Germany has lost, the Kaiser has fled, and everything that was certain has crumbled. The streets are full of refugees and displaced persons, people who have lost everything, people whose entire worlds have disappeared. Among them, somewhere, there must be survivors of the Russian Revolution. You have heard the stories. The Tsar and his family, executed in a cellar in Ekaterinburg in July of 1918. The Bolsheviks had announced the Tsar's death, but they had been vague about the family. Rumors persisted that some had survived, that one or more of the children had escaped. The youngest daughter, Anastasia, was said by some to have crawled from beneath the bodies of her family, rescued by a sympathetic soldier, spirited away to safety. It was a romantic story. It was almost certainly not true. But in the chaos of the Russian Civil War, with the Bolsheviks in power, and the truth deliberately obscured, who could say for certain? A young woman was pulled from the Landwehr Canal on the 17th of February, 1920. She had jumped from a bridge, apparently attempting suicide. She was soaked, nearly frozen, barely conscious. The police brought her to a hospital, and from there she was transferred to a psychiatric facility. She would not give her name. She would not explain who she was or why she had tried to kill herself. She spoke very little at all. She was registered as Fräulein Unbekannt, Miss Unknown, just another damaged soul in a city full of them, another victim of the catastrophes that had engulfed Europe. For nearly 2 years, she remained Fräulein Unbekannte, withdrawn, often silent. She gave the doctors little to work with. There were scars on her body, what looked like the marks of old wounds, possibly from bullets or bayonets. She seemed traumatized, clearly suffering, but from what no one could say. And then, in 1922, another patient recognized her. The patient's name was Clara Puthert. She had been looking at a magazine, a publication that featured photographs of the Russian royal family. Those glamorous, doomed people whose faces had become famous around the world. Clara looked at the photographs, looked at Fräulein Unbekannt, and became convinced. "You are Tatiana," Clara said, naming one of the Tsar's daughters. "You are Grand Duchess Tatiana." Fräulein Unbekannt did not confirm this, but she did not deny it either, and when pressed, she eventually spoke, not claiming to be Tatiana, but someone else. Someone younger. "I am Anastasia," she finally said. "I am the Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna of Russia." And with those words, she began a journey that would last 64 years, consuming the rest of her life, and dividing everyone who encountered her into believers and doubters, into those who were certain she was telling the truth, and those who were equally certain she was a fraud. The woman who would become known as Anna Anderson, she took this name later, one of many she would use, had a story to explain her survival. It went like this. On that terrible night in Ekaterinburg, when the family was woken and led to the cellar, when the soldiers began firing, she had not died. She had been wounded. Badly wounded, but she had fallen beneath the bodies of her mother and sisters. The soldiers had assumed she was dead. But she was not. A soldier named Alexander Tchaikovsky, one of the guards, she said, had discovered she was alive while the bodies were being removed. He was sympathetic. Perhaps he had fallen in love with her, or perhaps he simply could not bring himself to kill a wounded girl. He and his family had smuggled her out of Russia, traveling through Romania, eventually making their way to Germany. She had given birth to a child along the way, she claimed, Tchaikovsky's child. The child had been left with his family. She had arrived in Berlin alone, traumatized, unable to cope with what had happened to her, and she had jumped into the canal because she could not bear to go on, could not bear to reveal who she was, could not bear the weight of being the sole survivor of her family's massacre. It was, you must admit, a plausible enough story, just barely plausible, full of gaps and conveniences, but not obviously impossible, and she had details, remarkable details, that seemed to support her claim. She knew the layout of the Alexander Palace, the Romanovs' primary residence. She recognized people in photographs, identifying members of the extended family and household. She knew intimate details about life in the Russian court, nicknames, habits, private matters that it seemed impossible for an outsider to know. She bore physical similarities to Anastasia, the same build, similar coloring, comparable bone structure, and there were those scars consistent with bullet wounds that seemed to corroborate her story of survival. Members of the Romanov extended family came to meet her. Some were immediately convinced. "This is Anastasia," they said. "I know it. I can feel it." Grand Duke Andrei, a cousin of the Tsar, became her champion, publicly declaring his belief in her identity. Tatiana Botkin, daughter of the family's physician who had died with them in the cellar, recognized her childhood playmate in this traumatized woman. Others who had known the real Anastasia embraced Anna as the lost princess returned. But others were equally certain she was a fraud. The Dowager, Empress Maria Fafadovna, Anastasia's grandmother, refused to meet her. Grand Duchess Olga, the Tsar's sister, did meet her, and walked away unconvinced. "She is not my niece," Olga declared. "I would know my own niece, and this is not her." The doubters pointed out inconsistencies. Anna's German was better than her Russian, strange, for a woman who had grown up in the Russian court. She could not speak French fluently, though the real Anastasia had been educated in French from childhood. She did not recognize certain people she should have known, while recognizing others. Her story of escape had suspicious gaps and contradictions. And there was another theory about her identity, one that gained strength over time. She was not Anastasia Romanov at all. She was Franziska Shanskowska, a Polish factory worker from Pomerania. Franziska had disappeared around the time Fräulein Unbekannt appeared. Franziska had worked in a munitions factory and had suffered a serious injury when a grenade she was handling exploded, an injury that could account for the scars Anna bore. Franziska had a history of mental instability, and when a private investigator tracked down Franziska's family and showed them photographs of Anna Anderson, they recognized her immediately. "That is my sister," said Franziska's brother. "That is Franziska Shanskowska." But Anna, or Anastasia, as she insisted, denied this completely. She had never heard of Franziska Shanskowska. She had never worked in a factory. She was the Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna of Russia, and she would spend the rest of her life trying to prove it. The legal battles began in 1938, when Anna filed a claim to the Romanov fortune, substantial assets frozen in German and English banks since the revolution. If she could prove she was Anastasia, she would inherit millions. The case dragged on for decades, becoming the longest identity trial in German history. Witnesses were called, evidence was examined, experts testified on both sides. The courts heard from believers and doubters, from Romanov relatives, and handwriting analysts and medical specialists. And in the end, the courts could not decide. In 1970, after more than 30 years of litigation, the German court ruled that Anna had failed to prove she was Anastasia, but also that the opposition had failed to prove she was not. The question remained officially unresolved. Anna lived out her final years in Virginia, in the United States, where she had moved in 1968. She married a history professor named John Manahan, a man who believed completely in her identity as Anastasia. She lived quietly, increasingly reclusive, increasingly eccentric. She hoarded animals. Dozens of cats filled her home. She became hostile to visitors, paranoid about those who might want to harm her or expose her. She died in 1984, still insisting she was Anastasia. She had lived as the Grand Duchess for 64 years. But the story does not end with her death, because science in the end provided the answer that courts and witnesses could not. In 1991, the remains of the Romanov family were exhumed from their grave near Ekaterinburg. DNA testing, a technology that had not existed when Anna first made her claim, was performed on the bones. The results were conclusive. 9 bodies were found, corresponding to the Tsar, his wife, 3 of their daughters, and 4 servants. 2 children were missing from the main grave, but in 2007, additional remains were discovered nearby. They belonged to the missing 2, Alexei, the heir, and one of the daughters, most likely Maria or Anastasia. All 7 members of the immediate imperial family had died in that cellar in 1918. There was no survivor. There could not have been a survivor. And then the final proof came. A hospital in Charlottesville, Virginia, had kept a tissue sample from Anna Anderson, taken during a medical procedure in 1979. In 1994, 10 years after her death, DNA was extracted from this sample and compared to the Romanov remains. Anna Anderson was not Anastasia. She was not related to the Romanovs at all. And when her DNA was compared to living relatives of Franziska Shanskowska, the match was unmistakable. Anna Anderson was indeed Franziska Shanskowska, the Polish factory worker who had disappeared in 1920. The mystery was solved. The question that had consumed decades, divided families, filled courtrooms and newspapers and books, was finally answered by a technology that Anna herself could never have imagined. But here is what I find most haunting about her story, what keeps me thinking about it, long after the facts have been settled. Did she know? Did Anna Anderson know she was Franziska Shanskowska? Did she know, every moment of those 64 years, that she was living a lie? Was she a conscious fraud, a deliberate impersonator, who maintained her deception through sheer will? Or had she convinced herself, had the trauma of the factory explosion, the mental instability that followed, the chaotic aftermath of the war, somehow fractured her sense of self so completely that she genuinely believed she was Anastasia? Had she, in some sense, become the Grand Duchess, not through fact, but through the sheer intensity of her belief? We will never know. Anna is dead, and she took her truth, whatever it was, with her. But I think about Franziska Shanskowska, the woman she was before she became Anna Anderson, a factory worker in wartime Germany, a young woman injured in an explosion, traumatized, unstable, a person whose life had been small and hard and full of suffering. And then I think about Anastasia, the princess, the legend, the romantic symbol of lost Russia, the glamorous girl in the photographs, surrounded by wealth and beauty and love, destroyed by forces beyond her control. If you were Franziska, if your life had been nothing but labor and pain and invisibility, and if the world offered you a chance to be Anastasia instead, would you take it? Would you slip into that identity, wrap it around yourself like a silk gown, and never let it go? I am not excusing fraud. I am not saying Anna Anderson was right to claim what she claimed, but I am saying that the human desire for a different life, for a different self, is powerful beyond measure, and when that desire meets trauma, meets desperation, meets the chaos of a world turned upside down, strange things can happen. Anna Anderson lived as Anastasia for 64 years, whether she believed her own claim or not. She inhabited that identity so completely that it became inseparable from who she was. She is buried in Virginia under the name Anastasia Manahan. The lie, if it was a lie, became her truth. Let that thought carry you towards sleep. If you are drifting, the woman who might have forgotten who she really was, the princess who never existed inhabiting the body of a factory worker from Poland, the mystery that science solved but psychology never will. Rest for a moment. We have traveled far tonight, from a road in Gloucestershire to a canal in Berlin. We have met Mary Baker and Anna Anderson, women separated by a century, but united by the same impossible desire to become someone else entirely. In our next chapter, we will journey back further in time to 17th century London, where we will meet a woman even more audacious than either of them. Mary Carleton, the so-called German princess, was a con artist so brilliant that she defended herself in court, won her case, and became a celebrity. She inspired plays written about her while she was still alive, and she performed in them, playing herself. Her story is one of genius and tragedy. of a woman who could have been anything but was permitted to be nothing, and who was eventually destroyed by the only avenue of ambition available to her. But that story will wait. Sleep, if you are ready. The night is long, and there is no hurry. These women have been waiting centuries for their tales to be told. They can wait a few hours more while you rest. And when you return, Mary Carleton will be there, waiting in the dock of the Old Bailey, preparing to deliver the performance of her life. You are sitting in the gallery of the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court, on a warm June day in 1663. The courtroom is packed, every seat taken, people standing in the aisles, more gathered outside, trying to hear through the open windows. You have never seen such a crowd for a trial, not for murderers or traitors or thieves. But then, this is no ordinary trial. The woman in the dock is perhaps 29 years old, with striking looks and an air of remarkable composure. She is well dressed, her bearing confident despite her circumstances. She has been charged with bigamy, marrying a man when she already had a living husband. In the 17th century, this was a serious crime, punishable by imprisonment or worse. But the bigamy charge is almost secondary to the real drama, because this woman, Mary Carleton, stands accused of something more elaborate than simply having two husbands. She is accused of impersonation, of fraud, of convincing London society that she was a German noblewoman, Maria de Woolway, a princess in her own right, when she was actually nothing of the kind. The prosecutor has laid out the case against her. She is Mary Moders, they say, born in Canterbury to a fiddler, a common musician, respectable perhaps, but nothing more. She married a shoemaker's apprentice named Thomas Stedman, abandoned him, and wandered the country reinventing herself. She arrived in London claiming to be German royalty, deceived the Carleton family into believing she was wealthy, married their son John under false pretenses, and was exposed when her first husband was found alive. The case seems open and shut. There are witnesses who knew her in Canterbury. Her first husband is present to testify. The deception has been unravelled, the truth laid bare, and now it is Mary's turn to speak. In the 17th century, defendants in criminal trials often could not have lawyers represent them. They had to speak for themselves, make their own arguments, cross-examine their own witnesses. For most defendants, this was a catastrophic disadvantage. Few ordinary people had any legal training or courtroom experience. But Mary Carleton was not most defendants. She rose to speak, and from her first words, she transformed the courtroom. She did not merely deny the charges, she turned the entire narrative on its head. She argued that she was the victim, not the perpetrator. The Carleton family, she declared, had deceived her, had presented themselves as wealthier and more prominent than they were, had pursued her for her supposed fortune, had married her to their son in hopes of enriching themselves. When they discovered she had no fortune to give them, they had cried fraud. They had invented charges. They were persecuting her to cover their own embarrassment and greed. She spoke eloquently, passionately, with a command of language and argument that astonished the observers. She picked apart the prosecution's evidence, pointed out inconsistencies in the testimony against her, raised reasonable doubts about whether her first marriage had been legally valid. She was brilliant, not just intelligent, but genuinely brilliant, displaying a legal mind that would have been remarkable in a trained advocate, let alone an uneducated woman from Canterbury, and the jury acquitted her. The verdict stunned everyone. The evidence of her deception had seemed overwhelming, but Mary's performance, and it was a performance, a virtuoso display of rhetoric and self-presentation, had created enough doubt. The jury found her not guilty of bigamy. She walked out of the Old Bailey a free woman, but more than that, she walked out a celebrity. London was electrified by the trial. Everyone was talking about Mary Carleton, the so-called German princess, who had outwitted the legal system. Her audacity was astonishing, her cleverness undeniable. People wanted to see her, to hear her, to witness this remarkable woman for themselves. And Mary, ever the opportunist, gave them what they wanted. Within months of her acquittal, she published her autobiography, The Case of Madame Mary Carleton. It told her story, or rather, her version of her story, presenting herself as the wronged party, the innocent victim of the Carleton family's greed. It was a sensation, read and discussed throughout London. But that was only the beginning. Plays were written about her case, multiple plays by different authors, offering various perspectives on the scandal, and Mary appeared in them. She took to the stage, playing herself in dramatizations of her own life. She was, as far as we know, the first person in English theatrical history to achieve this peculiar meta-celebrity, performing her own scandal, turning her own fraud into entertainment, becoming famous for being infamous. Think about what this required: the confidence to stand before audiences who knew she was a convicted impersonator, acquitted, yes, but hardly proven innocent, and perform the role of herself. The audacity to monetize her own disgrace. The showmanship to make people pay to see the woman who had fooled them. For a brief period, Mary Carleton was one of the most famous women in England. She sat for portraits, she gave interviews, she moved through London society with an assurance that bordered on arrogance, or perhaps crossed that border entirely. But fame, for Mary, could not last. Because fame does not pay rent, celebrity does not buy food, and Mary had no legitimate means of supporting herself. Here is the tragedy at the heart of her story. Mary Carleton was genuinely gifted. Her courtroom performance revealed a mind capable of legal argument, rhetorical skill, and strategic thinking. Her ability to maintain complex personas showed intelligence and discipline. Her published writing demonstrated literacy and narrative ability. In another era, with other opportunities, she might have been a lawyer, an actress, a writer, an entrepreneur. But in 17th century England, these paths were closed to women, especially to women of low birth. The law did not admit women. The respectable stage barely tolerated them. Writing was possible, but rarely profitable. Trade and commerce were dominated by men. What was a clever, ambitious, capable woman supposed to do? Mary's answer was the only answer available to her: crime. After her brief celebrity faded, she returned to what she knew: confidence tricks, theft, petty fraud. She was arrested repeatedly over the following decade, always slipping away somehow, through charm, through luck, through the gaps in a legal system not designed to deal with someone like her. In 1671 she was convicted of theft and sentenced to transportation, exile to the colonies, to Jamaica, where she would serve out her sentence in what amounted to indentured servitude. It was the end, or should have been. She had been given one more chance, a harsh chance but a chance nonetheless, to start over somewhere far from London. But Mary came back. Why, we don't know exactly. Perhaps she couldn't bear exile. Perhaps she thought she could return undetected. Perhaps she simply could not stop running cons, could not stop reaching for more, could not stop being who she was. She returned to England illegally. She resumed her old ways, and in 1673, she was caught again, this time for stealing a piece of silver plate from a house where she had wormed her way in under false pretenses. Under the law of the time, returning from transportation was itself a capital offense. Mary had been sentenced to exile. By coming back, she had forfeited her life. The theft charge was almost irrelevant. She was going to hang regardless. On the 22nd of January, 1673, Mary Carleton was executed at Tyburn. She was approximately 39 years old. Contemporary accounts say she died bravely, with the same composure she had shown in the courtroom a decade earlier. She was theatrical to the end, playing her final role before her final audience. The crowd that gathered to watch her die was enormous, larger than for many far more serious criminals. Even in death, she was a celebrity. What do we make of Mary Carleton? I think she was a tragedy disguised as a scandal. A woman of genuine gifts, trapped in a world that had no place for gifted women, unless they were also wealthy, unless they were also male, unless they had been born into the narrow circumstances that would allow their gifts to flourish. Mary was not wealthy, Mary was not male, Mary was a fiddler's daughter from Canterbury, and everything she achieved, her celebrity, her infamy, her brief taste of fame, she achieved by breaking the law, because the law was not designed to let her achieve anything at all. This does not excuse her crimes. People were hurt by her frauds. The Carleton family, however flawed, had been deceived. Other victims followed over the years. Mary was not a noble outlaw, not a hero. She was a con artist and a thief. But she was also a human being with abilities that her society wasted. And when we look at her story, we should ask not just why did she commit these crimes, but why were these crimes her only option? The answer is damning, not of Mary, but of the world that made her. Rest here for a moment. Let Mary Carleton's story settle. The brilliant courtroom defense, the impossible celebrity, the slow decline back into crime, the gallows at Tyburn. She is buried somewhere in London, unmarked, forgotten. But her story survived in the plays that were written about her, in the autobiography she published, in the court records and newspaper accounts that documented her extraordinary life. And in a strange way she achieved something lasting. She is remembered. Centuries later, we are still talking about Mary Carleton, the German princess. Her fraud outlived her. Her performance became permanent. In our next chapter, we move forward in time to 18th century France, where we will encounter a fraud even more consequential than Mary's Jeanne de Valois. Saint Remy did not impersonate royalty directly, but she hired someone else to do it. She forged a queen's letters, and she orchestrated a scheme so audacious that it helped bring down the monarchy itself. The affair of the diamond necklace is one of the great scandals of European history, and at its center stands a woman who was genuinely of royal blood, but so impoverished that she felt entitled to take what she believed she was owed. Her story reveals something different from the others we've encountered. What happens when someone has a legitimate grievance, a real injustice in their history, and uses it to justify crimes that spiral beyond control. But for now, let Mary rest. She has performed enough. Sleep, if you are tired. And when you wake, we will travel to Versailles. Picture the most expensive necklace ever created. No, truly picture it. Let your mind construct this impossible object, this fantasy of wealth, made real. 647 diamonds, totaling 2,800 carats, arranged in garlands and festoons and cascading chains that would drape across a woman's neck and chest, like a waterfall of frozen light. Each stone individually cut, individually set, individually worth a fortune. The whole assembly weighing something close to 3,000 grams, nearly 7 pounds of diamonds. The jewelers Boehmer and Bassange had spent years assembling these stones, searching Europe for diamonds of sufficient quality, investing their entire fortunes in this single piece. They had designed it for Madame du Barry, the mistress of Louis XV, sure that the king would purchase it for her, but Louis XVI died before the sale could be completed. His grandson, the new King Louis XVI, offered the necklace to his wife Marie Antoinette, but she refused it, saying the money would be better spent on warships for the French Navy. The jewelers were trapped. They had invested everything in this necklace. They had borrowed to finance its creation, and now it sat in their shop, a monument to extravagance that no one would buy. They were facing ruin. It was into this desperation that a woman stepped forward with an extraordinary proposition. She said she could arrange for Queen Marie Antoinette to purchase the necklace in secret. The Queen, she claimed, wanted it desperately but could not be seen buying something so extravagant when France was drowning in debt. She needed a go-between, a discreet intermediary, to handle the transaction quietly. The woman's name was Jeanne de Valois, Saint Remy, Countess de la Motte, and she was about to orchestrate one of the greatest frauds in history. What made Jeanne different from the other women we have met tonight is this: her claim to royal blood was genuine. She was in fact descended from the Valois kings, the royal dynasty that had ruled France before the Bourbons. Her ancestor was an illegitimate son of King Henry II, born in the 16th century. The connection was distant, yes, diluted through generations and tainted by illegitimacy, but it was real. Jeanne was, in a technical sense, of royal descent. And yet she had been born into poverty so extreme that she and her siblings had begged on the streets as children, literally begged, holding out their hands to passers-by, asking for coins to survive. They were recognized. Eventually the state granted them small pensions acknowledging their royal descent, but the pensions were pittances. The gap between Jeanne's blood and her circumstances was vast, cruel, unjust. She married a man named Nicolas de la Motte, gaining the title of countess, but the title came without money. Jeanne was still poor, still struggling, still burning with the conviction that she deserved better than the life she had been given. And perhaps she was right. Perhaps in a just world, the descendant of kings would not have had to beg as a child. Perhaps there was something genuinely unfair about Jeanne's situation, a woman with genuine connections to royalty, living in poverty while others with no such claims lived in luxury. But Jeanne's response to this injustice was not to seek redress through legitimate means. It was to take what she felt she was owed, by any means necessary. The scheme she devised was elegant in its audacity. First, she needed a mark, someone wealthy and powerful and gullible. She found Cardinal de Rohan, one of the most prominent men in France. He was Grand Almoner, the official responsible for dispensing royal charity. He had access to vast resources. And he had a problem. He had deeply offended Marie Antoinette years earlier, and he was desperate to regain her favor. Jeanne presented herself to the cardinal as a close friend of the queen. She began relaying messages between them, messages that were, of course, entirely fabricated. Jeanne wrote letters that seemed to come from Marie Antoinette, expressing a thawing of her attitude toward the cardinal, suggesting that perhaps she was willing to forgive him. The cardinal was desperate to believe. Confirmation bias is a powerful force. We see what we want to see, believe what we want to believe, and the cardinal wanted so badly to believe that the queen was opening her heart to him, that he accepted Jeanne's fabricated letters without question. But letters alone were not enough. Jeanne needed something more convincing, some proof that would cement the cardinal's belief and make him willing to act on the queen's supposed behalf. So she arranged a meeting in the gardens of Versailles. On a dark night in August of 1784, the cardinal came to a secret rendezvous. He believed he was meeting Marie Antoinette herself, who had agreed to a private reconciliation. And there, in the shadows of the grove, he saw her, a slender figure in a white gown, her face barely visible in the dim light. She handed him a rose. She whispered a word of forgiveness, and then she retreated, disappeared, leaving the cardinal alone with his pounding heart and his overwhelming gratitude. The woman was not Marie Antoinette. She was Nicole de D'Oliva, a young prostitute whom Jeanne had hired for the occasion. Nicole was chosen because she roughly resembled the queen in build and coloring, at least enough to pass in the darkness. She had been told almost nothing about the real purpose of the meeting. She was simply playing a role, like an actress, for a payment that seemed generous to her. But to the cardinal, that brief encounter was everything. He had met the queen. She had forgiven him. He was restored to her favor. He would do anything for her now. And so, when Jeanne came to him with an unusual request, he agreed without hesitation. The queen, Jeanne explained, wished to purchase an extraordinary diamond necklace, but she could not do so openly. The political situation was too delicate, the criticism of royal extravagance too fierce. She needed the cardinal to act as her agent, to purchase the necklace in his name. The queen would repay him in installments, secretly, over time. The cardinal obtained the necklace from the jewelers. He passed it to Jeanne, who was to deliver it to the queen. Jeanne and her husband immediately broke the necklace apart. They pried out the diamonds, separating them from their settings. Nicholas fled to London with most of the stones, where he began selling them through various fences and dealers. The most expensive necklace ever created was reduced to its component parts and scattered across Europe. When the first payment from the queen came due, nothing arrived. The jewelers, growing anxious, approached Marie Antoinette directly, expecting their money. Marie Antoinette had no idea what they were talking about. She had never wanted the necklace. She had never agreed to buy it. She had never met the cardinal in the gardens, had never written those letters, had never asked anyone to act on her behalf. She was completely, utterly innocent of any involvement in the scheme. The scandal exploded. Cardinal de Rohan was arrested at Versailles, in full view of the court. Jeanne and her husband were arrested. Nicholas in absentia, having fled to England. Nicole d'Oliva was arrested. The forger who had created the fake letters was arrested. France was consumed by the trial of the century. The cardinal, it emerged, had been a fool, but not a criminal. He had genuinely believed he was acting for the queen. The court acquitted him, finding that he had been deceived, rather than complicit. It was an embarrassing verdict for the crown. It implied that even a cardinal could reasonably believe the queen capable of such intrigue. Nicole d'Oliva, the young woman who had played the queen in the garden, was also acquitted. She had not understood the larger scheme. She was merely a pawn. But Jeanne was convicted. She was stripped naked before the court, her screams echoing through the chamber. She was whipped, and she was branded with a V on each shoulder, for Folius, thief. The red, hot iron seared into her flesh, marking her permanently as a criminal. She was sentenced to life imprisonment in the Salpe, Trédillard, the notorious women's prison in Paris. But even this was not the end. Incredibly, Jeanne escaped from prison about a year later. The details of her escape remain murky, possibly involving bribery or powerful protectors. She fled to London, where her husband awaited her, where she was beyond the reach of French justice. And from London, she began to write. Jeanne published memoirs, multiple volumes, telling her version of events. In her account, she was not the mastermind, she was the victim. Marie Antoinette, she claimed, had actually been involved in the scheme from the beginning. The Queen had used Jeanne as a cat's paw, a deniable intermediary, and then abandoned her when things went wrong. It was a lie, it was almost certainly a complete fabrication, but many people believed it. The French public, already suspicious of their Austrian queen, already hostile to royal extravagance, found Jeanne's accusations plausible. The affair of the diamond necklace became one of the scandals that undermined Marie Antoinette's reputation, contributing to the revolutionary sentiment that would eventually destroy the monarchy. Jeanne died in 1791, apparently falling from a window in London. Whether it was suicide, accident, or murder has never been determined. She was 34 years old. And here is the dark irony of her story. The woman she had impersonated, the queen whose letters she had forged, the royal figure whose name she had used for her own ends. Marie Antoinette was executed 2 years later, guillotined in the Place de la Révolution, as the mob cheered. The scandal that Jeanne had created was one thread in the tapestry of resentments that brought the queen to her death. Jeanne de Valois Saint-Remy did not impersonate royalty herself, not directly. She hired Nicole d'Oliva to briefly play the queen in the garden. She forged letters in the queen's name. She used her own genuine royal blood as a credential, a foot in the door, a claim to proximity and access. But in a sense, she did something more profound than direct impersonation. She created a fiction around the queen, a fictional Marie Antoinette, who wanted the necklace, who wrote those letters, who met the cardinal in secret. And that fictional queen, Jeanne's creation, did as much damage as any real person could have. Consider what this reveals about royal identity in the 18th century. Marie Antoinette was the Queen of France. She was one of the most powerful and prominent women in the world. And yet her identity could be usurped, her words could be forged, her image could be impersonated, and the public could be made to believe things about her that were utterly untrue. Identity, even royal identity, was not secure. It could be borrowed, counterfeited, exploited, and the consequences of such exploitation could bring down kingdoms. Rest here for a moment, let Jeanne's story settle in your mind alongside the others. Mary Baker inventing a princess from scratch. Anna Anderson claiming to be the survivor of a massacre. Mary Carleton talking her way out of conviction. And Jeanne de Valois Saint-Remy, stealing diamonds in a queen's name, helping to destroy a monarchy without ever meeting the queen she impersonated. These women span centuries and circumstances, but they share something essential. They understood that identity is not fixed, that it can be performed, that the gap between who you are and who you claim to be can sometimes be bridged through sheer audacity. In our final full chapter, we will travel to somewhere stranger still, to a case that challenges everything we think we know about belief, evidence, and the power of collective desire. We are going to Portugal in the late 16th century, where a woman would emerge claiming to be King Sebastian I, not a princess, not a queen, a king, a male monarch, with a male body, who had died in battle in Morocco. She was obviously visibly, undeniably a woman, and yet thousands believed she was the lost king, not because they were stupid, not because they were deceived by a clever disguise, but because they wanted to believe so desperately that their own eyes became unreliable. It is the strangest story we will encounter tonight, and it will bring us to the heart of what royal impersonation really means. Not just fraud, not just desperation, but the extraordinary power of belief to reshape reality. But rest for now, sleep, if you are drifting. These stories will keep. To understand why a woman could claim to be a dead king and be believed, you need to understand Portugal in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, and you need to understand the particular, almost religious fervor surrounding one young monarch who rode into battle and never came home. King Sebastian I of Portugal was born in 1554, 3 weeks after his father died. He became king at the age of 3, raised by his grandmother and various regents, educated by Jesuits, and shaped by the crusading ideology of the Counter-Reformation. From childhood, he was obsessed with one idea, a great Christian crusade against the Muslims of North Africa. Portugal had a long history of warfare in Morocco, Sebastian saw this as his destiny, to lead a glorious army into Africa, to conquer, to bring Christianity to the infidels, to earn eternal fame and secure his place among the legendary kings of history. In 1578, at the age of 24, Sebastian got his wish. He assembled an enormous army and invaded Morocco, aiming to place a friendly ruler on the Moroccan throne and extend Portuguese influence across North Africa. The Battle of Alsaqiba on the 4th of August 1578 was a catastrophe. The Portuguese army was destroyed, thousands were killed or captured. 3 kings died that day: the Moroccan Sultan, his rival claimant, and Sebastian himself. But here is the crucial detail: Sebastian's body was never positively identified. In the chaos of the battlefield, among the thousands of dead, the king simply vanished. Some said his body had been found and buried, then later ransomed and returned to Portugal for proper interment. But the identification was uncertain. There were doubts. There was room for hope. And Portugal needed hope desperately. Sebastian had no heirs. The throne passed to his elderly great-uncle, Cardinal Henry, who died 2 years later. And then, in 1580, Philip II of Spain, a powerful neighbor who had been circling Portugal for years, claimed the crown. Portugal was absorbed into the Spanish Empire. Portuguese independence was gone. The people did not accept this. They could not accept it, and so they created a belief that allowed them to keep hoping. Sebastian was not dead. He had survived the battle somehow. He was in hiding, or in captivity, or on a mysterious journey. But he would return, the desired one, they called him, Odiciado, and when he came back, he would drive out the Spanish and restore Portuguese independence. This belief, Sebastianism, became a quasi-religious faith. Prophets arose predicting Sebastian's return. The dates passed. He did not come, and new dates were set. Year after year, decade after decade, the belief persisted. Portugal waited for its lost king, and pretenders came forward to satisfy that waiting. In the decades following 1578, multiple men claimed to be King Sebastian. Some were obvious frauds, easily exposed. Others were more convincing, gathering followers and causing genuine political concern. The Spanish authorities now ruling Portugal took these pretenders seriously. Several were executed for their claims, but the most extraordinary case was different from all the others, because this pretender was not a man at all. The historical record is frustratingly incomplete about the details. We know that in the late 16th or early 17th century, sources disagree on the exact timing. A woman emerged in Portugal or its territories claiming to be the lost King Sebastian, not claiming to be Sebastian's widow, not claiming to be his daughter, not claiming any female identity at all, claiming to be Sebastian himself. The king returned at last. She was obviously a woman. Her sex was not disguised. Anyone who looked at her could see that she had a female body. This was not a case of successful cross-dressing, not a convincing masculine disguise. And yet people believed her. Not a handful of credulous peasants, thousands of people, educated people, people who knew what Sebastian had looked like, people who knew perfectly well that Sebastian had been a man. How is this possible? How can you believe something that your own eyes tell you is false? The answer lies in understanding how powerful the need to believe can be. Psychologists today have documented this phenomenon extensively. When we want something to be true badly enough, we can override our own perceptions. We find explanations for contradictory evidence. We reinterpret what we see to match what we want to believe. In extreme cases, we can literally fail to perceive things that contradict our beliefs. Our brains filter out the inconvenient data before it reaches conscious awareness. The Portuguese who followed the female Sebastian were not stupid. They were desperate. They had been waiting for decades for their king to return. They had staked their hopes, their faith, their national identity on the belief that he would come back. And when someone came forward claiming to be him, Anione, even someone obviously female, the desire to believe created its own reality. They told themselves explanations. Captivity had changed him. Magic was involved. The female appearance was a disguise, a protection against Spanish assassins. What they saw was not what was real. The truth was hidden beneath the surface. Their eyes were lying to them. Their faith told them the truth. This is not madness, not exactly. It is an extreme version of something we all do, every day. We see what we expect to see. We believe what we want to believe. We find reasons to discount evidence that disturbs us. The Portuguese who followed the female Sebastian were simply pushed to the extreme end of this normal human tendency. The female Sebastian's fate is lost to history. The records are incomplete. The source is contradictory. She was probably arrested eventually, probably executed or imprisoned by the Spanish authorities who had no patience for pretenders of any kind. Her name has not survived. Her origins are unknown. She appears in history as a phenomenon more than a person, a demonstration of what collective belief can accomplish, even against all evidence. But her story haunts me in a way the others do not. Mary Baker invented a princess. Anna Anderson claimed to be a survivor. Mary Carleton pretended to be noble. Jeanne de Valois, Saint Remy forged a queen's letters. All of these required deception, disguise, the hiding of true identity beneath false appearances. The female Sebastian hid nothing. Her true nature was visible for anyone to see, and it did not matter, because the people who believed in her were not looking with their eyes. They were looking with their hopes. What does this mean for us, lying here in the dark, thinking about identity and belief and the strange stories of royal pretenders? I think it means this: identity is not just a matter of fact, it is also a matter of agreement. When enough people agree that you are someone, you become that person in every way that matters socially. The female Sebastian was not the king, biologically, historically, but for her followers, she was the king because they agreed she was. Their collective belief created a social reality that was, for them, more real than the physical evidence of their own senses. This is unsettling. It suggests that truth is more fragile than we like to believe, that reality can be negotiated, disputed, overruled by consensus, that what we know can be defeated by what we wish. But perhaps it also suggests something more hopeful. If identity is partly a matter of agreement, then we have more power to define ourselves than we might think. We are not only what our bodies or our histories say we are also what we perform, what others recognize, what is agreed upon in the social world we inhabit. The royal pretenders understood this, intuitively or explicitly. They knew that a woman could become a princess, a factory worker could become a grand duchess, a fiddler's daughter could become a German noblewoman, not by changing the facts of their lives, but by changing the story that surrounded them, by performing a new identity, so convincingly that others agreed to accept it. They failed, most of them. In the end, the truth caught up with them, reality reasserted itself, but for a while, for months or years or decades, they were who they claimed to be. They lived different lives. They escaped their circumstances. They proved that the boundaries of identity are not as solid as they seem. Rest here, with this strange idea, the woman who was king, the thousands who believed her despite the evidence of their eyes. The power of hope to reshape reality, however briefly, however doomed. We are nearing the end of our journey tonight, but before we go, I want to take a few moments to look at how this phenomenon, royal impersonation, identity fraud, the claiming of thrones, has continued into our own time, because it has not stopped. Even in an age of DNA testing and photographic identification, people still claim to be lost royals, and other people still believe them. What does that tell us about human nature? What does it tell us about the persistence of certain desires, certain hungers, certain needs that no amount of scientific progress can satisfy? Let us explore this briefly before we sleep. You might think that in an age of DNA testing, dental records, and photographic identification, royal impersonation would be impossible, that science has solved the problem of identity verification, that no one could credibly claim to be a lost princess, when a simple cheek swab could prove them wrong. And yet the phenomenon continues. People still claim to be secret royals, lost heirs, hidden aristocrats, and more remarkably, they still find believers. Consider what happened after the DNA evidence conclusively proved that Anna Anderson was not Anastasia Romanov. You might expect that the controversy would have ended. The science was clear, the answer definitive. Anna was Franziska Shanskowska, the Polish factory worker. All the Romanov children had died in 1918. Case closed. But for some believers the case has never closed. They question the DNA evidence. They suggest the samples were contaminated, the tests fraudulent, the scientists corrupt. They have constructed elaborate theories, explaining why the evidence is wrong and their belief is right. This is not surprising, perhaps, when you understand how deeply some people were invested in the Anastasia story. For decades, certain communities had built their identities around believing Anna Anderson was the Grand Duchess. Families had taken sides. Books had been written, relationships formed or broken, lives shaped by this belief. When your identity is tied to a particular truth, evidence against that truth feels like an attack on your very self. And new claimants continue to emerge, even after the DNA evidence, even after the discovery and identification of all the Romanov remains. Women have come forward claiming Romanov descent. They offer elaborate explanations for why the evidence doesn't apply to them. Secret adoptions, switched babies, conspiracies to hide the truth. They find communities online that support their claims, that provide validation and encouragement, that help construct and maintain their alternative identities. The internet has transformed this phenomenon in interesting ways. In the past, a royal claimant needed to convince people face to face, needed physical presence and personal charisma. Today, claims can be made in communities built entirely online. You can be a lost princess in your digital life while maintaining an ordinary identity in your physical one. The feedback loop of belief can spin faster and tighter, with believers reinforcing believers across continents and time zones. Social media has also created new forms of identity performance that echo the royal impersonators of centuries past. People present themselves as wealthier, more glamorous, more connected than they really are. They construct online personae that bear only partial resemblance to their actual lives. They accumulate followers who believe in their constructed selves, who provide validation and attention, and sometimes even money. This is not the same as claiming to be an actual princess, but it exists on the same continuum. It reflects the same hunger for transformation, the same desire to become someone more interesting, or impressive or valuable than you feel yourself to be. It demonstrates the same understanding that identity is performed, that you can become someone different by acting the part convincingly enough. And it suggests that the psychological needs that drove Mary Baker to invent Princess Caraboo, that drove Anna Anderson to live as Anastasia for 64 years, that drove Mary Carleton and Jeanne de Valar, Saint Remy, and the female Sebastian, those needs have not disappeared. Technology has changed the methods, but not the motivations. We still want to escape ourselves. We still want to become someone new. We still want recognition and attention, and the feeling that we matter. The royal impersonators we have met tonight were extreme cases. They took these ordinary human desires and pushed them to extraordinary lengths, with extraordinary consequences. But in doing so, they illuminate something about all of us. They show us the potential within ourselves, the capacity for reinvention, for performance, for becoming someone other than who we started as. We don't have to impersonate royalty to learn from their stories. We can learn that identity is more fluid than we often assume, that the person we present to the world is always, to some extent, a performance, that we have more power to shape who we are than the circumstances of our birth might suggest. And we can also learn that there are limits, that reality has a way of reasserting itself, that frauds are usually exposed, that living a lie is exhausting and often ends badly. The cautionary part of these tales is real. Most of our royal impersonators ended their lives in poverty, in prison, or on the gallows. The escape they sought was temporary at best. But the dreams that drove them are not cautionary. They are human, they are universal, and they deserve our compassion, even when we cannot approve of the actions they inspired. As the night draws toward morning and these stories settle in your mind, I want to draw out what connects them all. What thread runs through Princess Caraboo and Anna Anderson, through Mary Carleton and Jeanne de Valois, Saint Remy, through the female Sebastian and the modern claimants we will never know by name. And that thread, I believe, is this: all of these women refused to accept the identities they were given. They looked at the lives laid out before them, lives of poverty, of service, of invisibility, of constraint, and they said no. They decided that who they were born to be was not who they would remain. They invented new selves, constructed new histories, performed new identities. They refused to be small. This refusal was not always admirable in its expression. They lied, deceived, defrauded. They hurt people. They broke laws. Some of them may have lost their grip on reality entirely, unable to distinguish between the selves they invented and the selves they were born with. But the impulse behind the refusal, that is something different. That impulse is the same one that drives anyone who has ever tried to become better than their circumstances allowed. It is the refusal to be limited by accident of birth. It is the belief that you are capable of more than the world is prepared to give you. It is the audacity to imagine yourself as someone magnificent. Most of us find legitimate ways to express this impulse. We pursue education, build careers, create art, form relationships that help us grow into fuller versions of ourselves. We don't need to commit fraud to become who we want to be. But the royal impersonators remind us of something important. The drive to transform is not always neatly expressed. Sometimes it erupts in desperate, destructive ways, especially when legitimate paths are blocked, when the world offers you no way forward, when the options are submission or invention. These women invented, they created themselves out of whole cloth, like Mary Baker, constructing an entire language for a princess who never existed. They performed themselves into being. Like Mary Carleton defending herself brilliantly in court, they claimed identities so firmly that they could not, or would not let them go. Like Anna Anderson, insisting she was Anastasia, until her dying day. And in doing so they revealed something about identity itself, that it is not fixed, not given, not determined entirely by the facts of biology or biography. Identity is also chosen, performed, agreed upon. We become ourselves through action and interaction, through the stories we tell and the stories others accept. This is not to say that reality doesn't matter, it does. DNA tests tell the truth. Records can be checked. Lies can be exposed. The facts of our lives form a substrate beneath our performed identities, and that substrate has its own power. But identity lives in the space between the facts and the performance. It lives in the gap between who we were born and who we have become. And in that gap, there is room for growth, for change, for transformation. As you lie there, perhaps already drifting, I want you to carry these women with you into sleep. Mary Baker, inventing a language and a mythology because the life she had was unbearable. Anna Anderson, becoming Anastasia so completely that she may have forgotten who she really was. Mary Carleton, performing herself on the stage of the Old Bailey. Jeanne de Valois Saint Remy, claiming the blood she genuinely possessed was worth more than society would pay. The nameless woman who was King Sebastian, believed despite the evidence of every eye. They were not heroes, some were criminals, some were victims of their own minds, some were driven by greed, others by desperation, others by forces we will never fully understand, but all of them believed, or acted as if they believed, that they deserved more than they had, that the identities they were born with were not the ones they had to die with, that imagination and performance could reshape reality, at least for a while. And in that belief, however misguided its execution, there is something recognizable, something human, something that speaks to the part of all of us that has ever wondered, what if I could be someone else entirely? What if I could step into a different life? What if the constraints around me are not as fixed as they appear? The constraints are not as fixed as they appear. These women proved that, over and over, in ways both magnificent and disastrous. May their stories settle gently into your dreaming mind. May you find in them whatever wisdom or entertainment or strange comfort they offer, and may you wake tomorrow secure in your own identity. But perhaps a little more aware that identity is something we create, not just something we are given. Sleep well, dear listener. And remember, you are already someone remarkable. You do not need to claim a throne to prove it. But if you ever feel small or stuck or limited by circumstances beyond your control, remember Mary Baker inventing a language, Mary Carleton defending herself brilliantly in court, the thousands who believed in a female Sebastian against all evidence. Remember that human beings have always found ways to become someone new, and they always will. Good night, sweet dreams. And if those dreams involve a crown, well, in dreams, anything is possible.